Joining me now is the Reverend Al Sharpton, president of the National Action Network and host of Politics Nation on MSNBC. And David Corn, bureau chief for Mother Jones and an MSNBC political analyst. And Rev, I do want to start with you because you know Rudy Giuliani. You've known him for a long time. It's interesting because the way that I kind of looked at Donald Trump is that he was like a national Rudy. Like, he behaved nationally the way Rudy behaved toward New Yorkers. Those of us who lived in New York experienced it. He was sort of a mini Trump. But to what extent do you think, just knowing both of these men, to what extent was Rudy influencing Trump to believe the lies and conspiracy theories that he at least claims to believe?
Well, it is clear that Trump's whole political behavior was one he learned watching Rudy Giuliani and the New York political scene, of bullying people, of racial division, one against the other. And I think that because in many ways Donald Trump learned the trade of politics, looking at a guy like Rudy probably had a lot of influence on how Donald Trump was going to react to losing an election. And also because Rudy Giuliani was a heralded U.S. attorney and then became America's mayor, he had the credentials to make advice that one could take seriously, even when you know you are motivated by your own ego in the terms of Trump to almost want to finish the lines that Rudy feeds you, but you have the comfort of knowing here's this very credible, great figure that knows law saying, yes, this theory, yes, this theory. And the desperation that Rudy Giuliani showed in trying to attach himself to Donald Trump, whether it was because he wanted limelight, no one knows. But the fall that he has taken and has not been able to at any point abort the fall. Yes, it's been slow, but it's been steady. At no point did he try to catch himself and save his own legacy. And here we sit looking at a civil jury waiting to see how much he must pay in money that reportedly he will not have anyway. But he still has a criminal trial. None of us that were critical of him during his years as mayor, when he had a very hostile relationship with the black community, particularly in New York, could have predicted that Rudy would fall this far and this fast.
Right. I mean, and David, I mean, the thing is, it is spectacular in the sense that this guy was a U.S. attorney. Like, he knows the law. He prosecuted RICO cases, yet he was willing to commit felonies. He was willing to beclown himself by going overseas to try to prove this cockamamie theory that the real theft of the election was Ukraine's trying to steal the election from Trump, just because Trump was mad that he got caught working with Russia to get elected in 2016. It's all about Trump's feelings and emotions that Rudy seems to be sort of trying to babysit and sort of put a binky in his mouth and say, no, I'll prove that all your crazy theories are true. And yet, how wild is it to you, just as a journalist watching this, that this guy was willing to commit crimes, including now lying outright in a ridiculous lie against these two election workers, causing them to be humiliated and attacked and threatened with death?
It's quite the narrative. He went from crusading prosecutor in New York, as you noted, locking up mob bosses and Wall Street crooks, white-collar criminals. He went very hard on them, to then becoming kind of a demagogic mayor, to now a sort of clownish figure. I mean, when he was the one, according to the testimony before the House January 6th committee, who basically told Trump on election night, don't concede. Go out there, say you won. There were also reports that he was a little bit inebriated at the time he did this. But I don't think Trump needed a lot of egging on to do that. But there was Rudy, a guy whose job used to be to lock up crooks and respect the law, telling the president to lie about victory. And then he goes on in those months afterwards with these clownish crusade. I mean, one highlight or lowlight of that whole point was when he went to Rusty Bowers, the Republican Speaker of the House in Arizona, and said he wanted him to block the electors. And Rusty said, he's testified to this, I said, bring me the evidence and I'll look at it. And then he flies out there with Jenna Ellis, another Trump attorney, and he shows up at the meeting and Rusty Bowers says, where's the evidence? And they look at each other and go, we kind of left it in the hotel room. And he goes, we have theories, but we don't have a lot of evidence. And a guy who spent decades in the legal field to behave this way is almost unfathomable. I mean, I don't know what made the turn with him. I have a theory. I think it has to do with his hatred of Hillary Clinton that put him in the Trump camp. But I think an important thing to remember at this moment is he's, after this, he has to deal, as the Rev noted, with this criminal case in Atlanta. There are 3 attorneys, former Trump attorneys, 3, Kenneth Chesebro, Sidney Powell, and Jenna Ellis, and they've all worked with Rudy in trying to overturn the election, and they all have now pleaded guilty, and they've said crimes were committed. By pleading guilty, they have conceded that in this effort to overturn the election that he led, crimes were committed. And 2 of those people, Sidney Powell and Jenna Ellis, were at that infamous hair-dyeing, dripping press conference. I don't know what we call it.
Yeah.
And so his own comrades have said, we committed crimes.
Yeah.
It really leaves him on a pretty big hook.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing is, Rev, I mean, I think that Rudy Giuliani is one of those people who's a triumph of substance of form over substance, right? I mean, people thought he was this great mayor because he had one good day on 9/11, but he's also the guy who, was forcing the NYPD to walk his girlfriend's dogs. That's not his wife. That would be his girlfriend he was cheating with. He's the guy who announced he was going to divorce his actual wife, during a TV press conference. I mean, this is not a guy who was really what he said he was. He tried to stay in office for a 3rd term illegally and said after 9/11, I'm just going to stay. That sounds like Trump. He's very similar. But I want to read the closing argument against Rudy. It says, day after day, Mr. Giuliani reminds you who he is, said Matthew Gottlieb, an attorney for the plaintiffs. He said Mr. Giuliani's defense strategy was to convince jurors he was more important than the women he defamed. Rich, famous people have valuable reputations, and ordinary people are irrelevant, replaceable, worthless. Mr. Giuliani's defense is his reputation, his comfort, and his goals are more important than those of Ruby Freeman and Shaye Moss. This is a fiction, and it ends today. There's also somebody who made money off 9/11. Let me play one of the voicemails left for Ruby Freeman. This was played during the trial.
You're going to jail, Ruby. You're going to get locked up, Ruby. That's election fraud, Ruby. What was on the USB drive, Ruby? You're all going to jail, you piece of
Rev, if you actually know what Rudy was like, it actually seems like this is kind of the fitting end, right? He played in racism. Racism was his stock and trade as mayor, and this is how he ends. This is just one of his many cases.
And when you look at the fact that his being mayor, he was the one that championed broken windows, stop and frisk, where he did not feel that parts of the city mattered like other parts of the city, that we had no rights, that anyone had to respect. Meet with black leaders when we had the shooting of Amadou Diallo, a young man took his key out in his best view of his house, and the police shot at him 41 times, hitting him 19 times, and it was his key, not a gun. And Rudy wouldn't even meet with black leaders, forget black activists like me. He would meet with the state controller, but the Manhattan Borough president at the time. He has always operated like it's us against them, and we are more important. And now the irony, I would say, what happens in karma and with God's will is 2 black women are the first to legally bring him where the black community suffered in his being mayor. It's ironic that 2 black women that he thought were marginal and unimportant, and he couldn't even take the stand and testify. Let's remember, he said he was going to take the stand. He was going to be able to stand up to all of this and expose the truth. And at the end, he was a no-show. He went from being a champion to being Roberto Duran. No mas, no mas. That's what happened today to Rudy Giuliani.
And there you go. Last word to you on this, David Corn. Let's put up a list of all that he's got to face. The Georgia 2020 election, federal trial, his unpaid legal fees. He's being sued by his former lawyer, Robert Costello. Sexual assault and harassment charges. These are really gross. The things he did to a former employee named Noel Dunphy, and also this defamation charge that could bankrupt him. Your thoughts on the twilight of Rudy Giuliani?
You know, I've always thought that one of the smallest type of person one can be is a bully. To use your power to punch down, and that's what he did with Ruby Freeman and Shaye Moss. He thought, and I think the Rev, just made this point, that he was more important, he was bigger, he could do whatever he wanted with their lives. And these are people who are election workers. People like this volunteer and go to work across the country every day to preserve our democracy. He had no respect. He had no respect, as I noted earlier, for the rule of law or for any facts. It was all whatever he could get away with because he was Rudy Giuliani.
Yeah.
Well, the fact that they brought down this bully is finally justice.
It is indeed, and we're awaiting that verdict still. We'll look tomorrow. Reverend Al Sharpton, David Corn, friends, thank you very much.